Good morning, welcome back. Today is June 26th, and because it's about 1,000 degrees outside and I'm a wimp, I am in here today where it's a little bit cooler to kind of talk briefly about the things that happen on this day that are of interest to me, and then we'll get back into talking about Luke. Well, first of all, it was on this date in 1483 that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became the King of England. Known as Richard III. Now, Richard III, he became king when Parliament declared Edward V to be illegitimate. Okay, now that may not mean a lot to many of you, but to some of us who are Shakespeare fans, we know first of all that Richard III is one of the great villains in the Shakespearean canon. Edward V is one of the two so-called princes in the Tower. And it'd be kind of interesting. Just look up the Princes in the Tower, and you get an interesting story there. And Richard III was king for only a couple of years. And of course, like I said, he was a villain in the Shakespearean realm. But there is a group, actually I believe it's called the Richard III Society, which are fans of good King Richard and have tried to reclaim his prestige as the years go on. In the play, Richard III is one of the great lines of Shakespeare that you may or may not know. It was from Shakespeare, but that is a horse, my kingdom for a horse. That is a line spoken by Richard near the end of the play. And Richard III is the king whose remains were found underneath a parking lot in England, 5 or 10 years ago. And he was ultimately reburied in a place more fitting for someone who was one of the kings of England. In 1498, the toothbrush was invented in China. They used a stick and boar's bristles to make a toothbrush. And so kudos to the Chinese for taking the lead there on tooth hygiene. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy on this date made his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, showing solidarity. It was made in Germany. It was made in West Berlin. He was showing solidarity with all of the Berlin residents, both the West Berlin and East Berlin. The city was divided at the time. And the interesting thing about that particular speech is, of course, he meant to show solidarity with the Berliners and say, I am a Berliner. But I'm told, and I'm not a German scholar by any stretch of the imagination, that word can also, or that phrase can also be translated, I am a donut. So take that for what it's worth. And a sad note, it was on this date in 1977 that Elvis performed his last concert. So he performed his last concert on this date in 1977 in Indianapolis. And went from there back to Graceland, where he died, about a month and a half. No, I guess it was August of 1977 was when he died. And speaking of Elvis, today is Colonel Tom Parker's birthday. Tom Parker, born on this date in 1909, and he was well known for being Elvis's manager. And portrayed by Tom Hanks in the new Elvis movie that just came out. I haven't seen the movie. I don't know if it's any good. I just know that Tom Hanks plays Colonel Tom Parker in it. So, all right, well, that's it. Today we're going to get back to talking about Luke chapter 20. We're going to get into the idea of controversy narratives and how they propel the story into the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So let's get back to talking about that. Welcome back. We're here today to talk about Luke chapter 20. And we want to remember where we are in the story and then where we are relative to what Luke is trying to accomplish, okay? Jesus is in Jerusalem. If you remember at Luke 19, Jesus was in the temple. He talked about, cleaning out the money changers and all of that. So Jesus is in Jerusalem. And we are right up to what's referred to as the Passion Week, and ultimately becomes the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So today what we're going to talk about are a series of what are often referred to as controversy narratives. Okay, and that is, they are a series of events. There are 5 fairly short segments where Jesus interacts with somebody or Jesus, Jesus interacts with somebody. And it kind of illustrates, as we get closer to his actual arrest, the animosity that's building up against Jesus. Okay, and I think that's why Luke puts these in here. Okay, and so I just want to say that because I know there's a tendency for some of these to take off on these statements and go, okay, there's great, these indicate great, big, important things, and to some extent they do. Don't get me wrong. But I'm like, we don't want to really build an entire doctrine on any one of these, okay? Any one of these statements, okay? I mean, if it supports something else, that's fine, okay? But keep in mind that what Luke is doing, and I think what Luke is doing here, is he's just illustrating the animosity that's building up against Jesus, okay? So let's keep that in mind as we go through these various controversy narratives, all right? And it starts right off in chapter 20, verse 1. Of course, now, the first controversy is Jesus going into the temple. So I guess Jesus kind of instigates the first controversy. And then this next one in chapter 20, beginning with verse 1, may be a reaction to that one in particular, the driving out of the money changers in the temple, or more likely it refers to that and several others, okay, or other previous things that Jesus is known for. All right, so let's look at chapter 20, beginning with verse 1. And I'll read the whole story, and then we'll kind of go back and talk about it a little bit. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" He replied, "I'll ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered him, "We don't know where it was from." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Okay, so here you've got this new coalition of opposition to Jesus. You have the chief priest. The chief priest and the teachers of the law, along with the elders. Okay, now the elders may include Pharisees, but generally speaking, the Pharisees are out of the picture at this point. Okay, but these representatives of these three groups come to Jesus, and maybe they just want to. Maybe they're really looking for an answer. Okay, maybe they really are, and which is different from several of the following stories. But they ask him two questions. Okay, what authority authorized this? Whatever it is you're doing, whether it's the temple, what you did in the temple, or the way you teach the people, or the crowd you have behind you, or all of these things we've heard tell about you. What authority is behind this? And once you identify the authority, tell us who gave it to you. Okay? To me, this is kind of similar to just saying, okay, who do you think you are? Okay? And so he asks that they ask him that question. Now, I don't know what kind of answer they were expecting. Maybe and it doesn't really matter because the text doesn't give us an answer here. The text doesn't tell us what they were looking for, but you can bet that they weren't looking for a question that will satisfy them and make them go away, okay? Because really, by this point, several of the leaders have already decided that Jesus has got to go, and it just gets worse as we go on. Well, Jesus doesn't fall for the trick, okay? He doesn't, or let's just say he doesn't rise to the bait, okay? Rather than ask the question, he asks them a question, okay? And my guess is just because he came back so quickly with it, they didn't have a chance to argue whether he should answer. You've been in that situation where you ask a question and somebody asks you a question. Instead, in response to your question, and you say, well, you ask my question first and then I'll answer your question. You kind of get into this whole little game. But here Jesus asks them, okay, John the Baptist, was he from heaven or was he from earth? Okay, simple question. Now, this coalition recognizes, and something you see about them is that they are just about appearances, okay? They're not after the truth here. And they're clearly not a group that follow John the Baptist. So they're in a kind of a tricky situation. They thought they'd gotten rid of John the Baptist. It was one of those kind of deals that, okay, let's just not talk about him. Okay, but they said they discussed it among themselves. So you have this inner dialogue again. If we say from heaven, they'll say, why didn't you believe him? A reasonable question, and they certainly don't believe that. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that they don't believe John the Baptist's messages from heaven, but they're afraid to say what they really think because they know that they're at odds with the people. Okay, now what's interesting about, there's a couple of interesting things about this is, first of all, once again, Jesus links together John the Baptist's ministry with his own ministry. John the Baptist's message with Jesus' message. And again, I've said this before and I'll say it again, that to me, once John the Baptist was taken out of the picture when he was killed by Herod, then the actual chance of accepting Jesus as king at that moment went out the window. That's my opinion as far as where the point in time was. And Jesus is just bringing that back up again. Okay, so they answered, we don't know where it was from. Okay, do they know? No, well, they don't know, but they're not going to say their opinion. And Jesus said in verse 8, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. Okay, now Jesus knows that if he tells them the truth, that is, he's the Son of God, that God the Father has given them, that it would result in an arrest right at that moment by these guys. Okay, and that would speed up the timetable, even by a couple of days, and he didn't want the timetable sped up. Okay, so Jesus actually just kind of parries the question and moves on, and that's it for this story. But he's not without making a point to them. Okay, so he parries the question, but then he tells the story. Okay, he went on to tell the people this parable. I'm in verse 9 now. Okay, so I'm going to start this parable of the tenants. And although it says at the start, and again, remember, you always want to know who the audience is. It says he told the people. We know from the end of the story, and the end of this is in verse 19, the teachers of the law and the chief priests, okay, that's two of the three groups of that coalition, looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against him, but they were afraid of the people, which we've already established, because they won't say what they really think about John the Baptist. All right, but so the chief priests and the teachers of the law are listening to this story, and they see themselves in this story, and it angers them. Okay, now that's going to drive how you interpret this particular story, this particular parable, because you know that whatever it is, the people that Jesus is addressing, heard it and it angered them. So that's who they represent. So let's tell the story real quick. He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruits of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I'll send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyards to others. When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people. Okay, so we have another story here of an absentee landlord. Now, this is not the first time we've had this story in Luke. In fact, just the previous chapter, we had this tale of the guy who goes to become king, and he leaves 10 minas with 10 people and comes back and all of that. So this idea of an absentee landlord, okay? And that's not a bad thing. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but it just means somebody who bought the land and gave it over to somebody to take care of it in his absence. Okay, and while he's gone, the cost is that you will pay this person some of your of the increase. Okay, when we talked about the dishonest manager, we suggested that this was the debt that these guys owed. That it was they were tenant farmers, and they owed a portion of their crop to the owner. Okay. So what happens is the man is gone a long time. So maybe he's gone such a long time that the tenants have kind of figured that they can just, whatever it is. He's never coming back. And then suddenly a servant shows up. Actually, it's a slave. Okay. A slave shows up and says, "Hey, I'm here from the owner, and he wants his cut of the profits." All right. Well, the tenants look at him and say, "Well, no, we're not going to give you anything." It says, so they beat him. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. So the owner sends another. Okay, this time they beat and treated shamefully. So they did something else to him that treated him shamefully in some way, marked him in some way. We don't know what. We can speculate, but it doesn't matter. And sent him away empty-handed. So once again, now this is two people that the owner of the land hasn't got what he wanted. Okay, hasn't gotten his share of the crop. So he sends a third servant. Okay, so he sends a third servant, and the third servant, they wound him. So this apparently is something in excess of just beating him. Maybe, I don't know, they stabbed him, they cut him, they did some sort of scarring, some sort of wound, and threw him away. And of course he went home empty-handed. Now the tenant, or the owner of the land, has now sent three slaves to get what his piece of the action, and he's gotten nothing. And so he says, "Well, I'll send my son, whom I love." Now this is kind of interesting, because when the man says, "I'm going to send my son, whom I love," this echoes what is said about Jesus at his baptism. Okay, this is my son, whom I love. Okay, kind of, an interesting thought there. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is here. They said, "Let's kill him." Now, this is not that absurd. Okay, it's a goofy story. But it's not that absurd for two reasons. Number one, that the son showed up, and it's probably that he's an only child, because otherwise this plan would be no good. But the fact that the son shows up might suggest that the owner, the father, has died, and the son is coming to take his inheritance. So they could see him, and maybe that's what they think when they see the son coming. They think, "Oh, the father/owner has died. So if we kill the son, then we'll become the heirs." Okay. Now this is not that unheard of an idea, that if there's no owner, then the tenants would sort of have kind of like a sharecropper, or not a squatter's rights to the land. Now keep in mind, there are already three servants into rejecting this. And even if they did suddenly say, "Oh yeah, you're the son, here's everything," no hard feelings about those three servants, right? Okay, that would probably not go over very well. So they're already in. Maybe they're in too deep, and they just figured, you know what, let's just kill the guy. Okay, thinking that they're getting away with something, thinking that they're going to benefit. Now there's a great thought process here you can start thinking about with what is, the path of disobedience, the path of sin, and just the increasingly desperate decisions people make to maintain their state of rebellion. Okay, just an interesting illustration here of that. And so, no doubt, the father got word from what happened to the first servant. The father knew what happened to the second servant. The father knew what happened to the third servant, and the father was certainly going to find out what happened to his son. Now, I don't mean to make light of this, but how happy is this father going to be? Not very. And that's why Jesus says, what's that father going to do? Okay, what's that father going to do? Well, he's going to come in with an army, with soldiers, with the police, with whoever, and kill those tenants that rejected him. So in other words, these tenants are going to lose everything. They're going to lose their livelihood. They're going to lose their hope. They're going to lose whatever promise they had, whatever income they had. They're going to lose their life. They're going to lose everything. Okay? When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Now this could be translated, may it not be so. Like, oh no, that's horrible. That's kind of a gut reaction to this. It's an interesting little phrase that's thrown in there. And perhaps the point is, that would never happen. That would never happen. Okay? And then Jesus brings in this passage from Psalm 118, and we've talked about this before. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, I've talked about this many times because I believe this passage is quoted multiple times in the New Testament. This is one of those passages that is again multiple quotations, and it's from Psalm 118, and we talked about this before. But the whole idea is this. Okay, the cornerstone is sort of the main stone. It's the corner, and the line of both walls come off of that. So it's very important that you get the right stone there. The other day for a fundraiser thing, I agreed to help set up chairs at the local community fest. And it was, so we're in this big tent. We're in this huge tent, and we're trying to, we have to set up the tables first. And you have all of these community organizers, all of these community officials in one position or another. And, trying to see these guys set up tables made me want to see them try to change a light bulb. But what was interesting is we're in this one tent, and we were talking about the first table, and I said to the person, because I was just there being my normal, helpful, chipper self, and I said, yeah, you got to get this one right, because if you don't get this one right, all the rest of the tables are going to be wrong. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of the cornerstone. Okay, the cornerstone is the main stone of a building. Okay, so who should know a good cornerstone? Builders, okay? People who do this for a living should be able to pick out a good cornerstone. And yet, this prophecy from Psalm 118 just says something about the stone the builders rejected. Those who should have known better didn't pick the right stone. They rejected the stone that ultimately did become the cornerstone, okay? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And then this passage goes on and says, when this all happens, that's the day that the Lord has made. Let's rejoice and be glad in it. But so people who knew missed what they should have known and picked the wrong thing. Okay? The tenants should have known that the appearance of the first servant meant that the father was still alive, the father was still active, the father still wanted his peace. Okay, but they rejected it. They rejected it. They rejected it again. They rejected it again. They rejected it again. Everyone who falls on that stone, that is the one that has become the cornerstone, will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. Now, this is clearly back in Psalm 118 and going forward. This is talking about a messianic issue. It's generally believed to be a messianic prophecy. So Jesus, I think, here is referring to himself, even though at the time the people aren't getting it. They're not getting the messianic element here about this question about the stone. But the Pharisees, but the chief priests and the teachers of the law know that they're being targeted here. Okay, so who looks bad in this story? Well, the tenants. And the chief priest and the teachers of the law see themselves as the tenants. So the story, the parable, really is pretty clear. What is the vineyard? Okay. Well, again, Isaiah 5 talks about Israel as being a vineyard. So Israel is a vineyard. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the elders, those left in charge are missing the point. They're missing the message. They're missing God's desire for their community, for their country. And so God sends messages. And so the prophets are, usually look at this and say the prophets are the ones, the servants. And then he sends his son, Jesus. And they're going to kill him. Okay, so they look at it. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, look at it and they think, "Hey, this guy is targeting us, and we don't like it." And the result is the teachers of the law look for a way to arrest him immediately, but they couldn't because they were afraid of the people. Okay, okay. So they go to Plan B or C or whatever. They go to their next plan. Verse 20: keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. Okay, it's kind of reminds me of the old joke, sincerity is the key to success. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. So here come these people, and they appear to be sincere. Okay, they hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. Okay, so they're hoping to get Rome to do their dirty work for them, and ultimately they do. Okay, but here this is an attempt to get Rome to, if they can get Rome to take care of them, then they don't have to worry about the theological implications of it. They don't have to worry about the people. They could just kind of say, "Oh yeah, it's we got rid of him that way." So it's kind of like, the prosecutors, if they can't get a crime lord on actual crime, they get him on tax evasion. They figure, and then, just trying to get something so he can get him out of our hair. Okay, so the spies questioned him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." Okay, now this is just serious buttering up. And I think even if Jesus didn't have insight that comes with being the God-man, he would have looked at this and said, this is just not, it's kind of like if you have a child, and your child wants something, and the child comes up to you and says, "Dear parent, you're my favorite parent. Okay? You're my favorite parent. Will you do this for me?" When clearly there's another parent. Okay? Or, if there's another parent, there's two parents, and somebody comes up, "You are my favorite parent." Or if you're in any kind of job where you are one of many, you're a teacher in a school, and somebody comes up to you and says, "You're my favorite teacher. Can you do this for me?" When you start laying the praise on a little too thick, people are looking and going, "Okay, what does he want? What does he want?" So even if Jesus didn't have any abilities beyond normal persons, I'm sure this was clear that these guys are not on the up and up. Okay? But they say, "Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, some have looked at this and said, okay, this is dealing with a very specific tax, which it might be. There might be in the moment, there might be a very specific tax. But I think the point that they're making, whether it's for a specific tax or a tax in general, is they're just trying to get Jesus to come down on the side of Rome or on the side of Israel. Now, this it illustrates the depths that they're going to go to, because if these guys are coming from Jewish leaders, and if Jesus comes down hard on the side of Israel, which is their side, they're still going to throw them under the bus. They're either going to throw him they're already going to turn him in to their enemy and let their enemy do their work for them. He saw through their duplicity and said to them, "Show me a denarius, a coin. Whose image and inscription are on it?" "Caesar's," they replied. So they could show a coin, and the coins at the time would have had the Caesar's. And sometimes they would have statements that said something to the effect of, worshiping Caesar, or to the one and only God, Caesar, things like that. And Jesus looks at it and sees Caesar's picture on it, and he hands it back to them. And he says, and we all know the famous King James translation of this: "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Okay? Now, this is an enigmatic answer to the question. Okay? It's avoiding the question. And this is an example of where we don't want to make too much out of this passage. We don't want to build an entire theology of two kingdoms, a la Martin Luther, the kingdom of earth and the kingdom of heaven, the two spheres of sovereignty that this illustrates. This is God teaching that there are two spheres of sovereignty. This is just a way of avoiding the question, because it's not a serious question. They're not looking for a serious question. They're just looking to trap him. And Jesus has found a way to answer the question in a way that they can't argue with him. Okay, that they can't push it without giving away their position at best. Okay, now and so again, there are other passages in the Bible that talk about our relationship to government and how we should support government or not support government, or when we should or when we shouldn't, and what we should do with taxes and all that kind of stuff. Okay, there are other passages, there are other examples. Okay, so you don't want to develop an entire theology based on just this particular passage, because this is a controversy narrative illustrating the growing animosity to Jesus among the leaders. Okay, and that's what it does. It is an enigmatic question that does not get resolved. Okay, they were unable to trap him. They couldn't take that answer to the Romans and say, "Hey, look," and they couldn't take it back to the Jews and say, "Look, he's a Roman." They were stuck. They were one-upped. They were beaten. Okay, and astonished by his answer, they became silent. Verse 27, some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. Now the Sadducees, I believe this is the first time we've heard of them. They're another one of the groups the religious groups in Israel at the time. And generally speaking, they would have been the more affluent and more liberal. And it's also believed that the Sadducees controlled the high priest's office. Okay. But the Sadducees would have been the more liberal, and it says here, we know something about what they believe. They don't believe in a resurrection. Okay? They came to Jesus with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brothers. Okay, now this is coming out of Leviticus 25, I think, but it's what's referred to as the Levirate marriage. Now, interestingly, according to historians at the time, by the 1st century, the whole custom of Levirate marriage had kind of gone gone by the wayside. But it was good for an argument, so let's go with it, right? So the Levirate marriage idea was that if a man has a wife and they don't have children, they don't have a son, and the man dies, then the man's brother would marry and have at least one child with, and preferably a son, hopefully a son, with the widow, the widow. Okay, and then when the son is born, that son in the legal universe would be seen as being the son of the brother who died, and that way that son would grow up and become the protector of the mother. Okay, so it was a way of maintaining the security of the family and all that. Okay, so the Sadducees, and to a certain extent it worked, and there's some elements of this in the story of Ruth. Some elements of this Levirate marriage come into play in that Old Testament story of Ruth. But so they come up with this story, interesting story. Teacher, they said. Again, remember, teacher is that kind of very low level, sort of like bare minimum, a bit of respect. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother, I read that. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman and died childless. Okay, so now we kick into the Levirate marriage. The second and then the third married her, and in the same way the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now this is kind of, on the one hand, this is kind of an absurd situation. I mean, can you imagine the thoughts going through the minds of the 6th and 7th brother as they were preparing for marriage with this woman? But be that as it may, the story itself, and the timing isn't quite clear, but there is a story very similar to this out of the Apocrypha. Okay, that in the Apocrypha are those 7 or 11 books that are oftentimes put in between the Old and the New Testament. Maccabees, Esdras, Wisdom of Solomon, these other books that are recognized by the Catholic Church as being substantially Scripture, but no Protestant denomination or leader has ever ascribed to them. But they are historical indicators, at least. I mean, Maccabees tells us a lot of what we know about the Hasmonean Revolt, and Antiochus Epiphanes and all of that stuff, a lot of the history of what's going on between the between the testaments. But there is, in one of the passages, there is a story very similar to this, and so that may be where they were drawing from. Okay, this may have been a common story. In fact, I think what this is for the Sadducees is this is their slam dunk argument against the resurrection. Okay, it's not unlike people who want to prove the absurdity of theology by asking questions like, can God make a rock so big he can't pick it up? Or how many angels fit on the head of a pin? Or these sort of questions that people create that are supposed to be, argument breakers. That they're going to, and so that's what they're saying. Now, the irony of this story, of course, is the Sadducees are asking this question about the nature of things in the resurrection when they don't believe the resurrection is going to happen at all. Okay? And so clearly they're not looking for truth here. They're just looking to show that Jesus' beliefs are inconsistent with the truth, that he's going to have to come down and he's going to have to show this absurd example. Okay? Well, Jesus replies in two ways. First of all, he says in verse 34, Jesus replied, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So Jesus is pointing out that, if you knew anything about the resurrection, and most people at the time didn't, and we don't know that much more, would say, he's pointing out, well, there's marriage isn't a question of the resurrection. Okay, so the Levirate marriage system was set up to protect people on earth, not to establish a family relationship in heaven. Okay, and so he says here that the marriage as we know it doesn't exist in heaven, and so your question is pointless. Okay, your question is pointless. Now I know, side note, I don't know how it's going to be in heaven. I don't know what the relationships are going to be. I do know that, based on what we know in Revelation, that being in the presence of God, being in the presence of the Lamb will be so overwhelming that the things that we thought were important will pale. Okay, there'll be no tears. There'll be no, will we know each other? I don't know. Maybe someday we'll get to Revelation. We'll talk about that. Okay. So let's see, where am I? So his first answer is to say marriage isn't an issue. And again, this is a controversy narrative. This is just showing the animosity that's developing, and Jesus is just parrying with all of these things that are coming down the pipe. And they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But, and then the second question is to point out that the resurrection is a true thing. That even, so now he's getting back to the hypocrisy of their question in the first place. Okay? So here, you don't understand the resurrection, and here's how it's going to be in the resurrection. You don't even believe, but here's why the resurrection is true. Here's just one quick proof that the resurrection is true. And he says, but in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And that the point he's making there, that for God to use the I am, I currently am the God of Jacob, Jacob has to be alive. He's not the God of the person who we used to call Jacob or the person we used to call Abraham. He's the God of a living Abraham, a God of a living Jacob, a God of a living who else did he point out here? Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so it's like this, even in the Torah, this indication of a resurrection is there. And if you had read that, you would know that. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. Now, verse 39 is kind of a funny little verse to me. It's like, some of the teachers of the law responded, well said, teacher. Now, I'm guessing these teachers of the law are not Sadducees. Or, if they are Sadducees, which they could be, again, teachers of the law, they're the Bible scholars. They could be Sadducees. Or they just realize they've been bested. They've been beaten. Okay, I like the idea of thinking that these teachers of the law, maybe they're Pharisees, who are kind of like the opposite end of the spectrum from the Sadducees. And they're kind of, there's another example where Jesus puts somebody in his or her place, and somebody says, "Well said, Master," kind of thing. And so I think that's kind of what's going on here. But it says in verse 40, and no one dared to ask him any more questions. Okay, so these major groups, okay, the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law came and approached him, and then they sent spies, and then the Sadducees come. They're all going to try and beat this guy, and they all come away frustrated with it. Then Jesus says to them, now this is kind of interesting here, he's quoting from Psalm 110, why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David? Okay, now, again, remember when we talked about the man that was calling Jesus son of David, have mercy on me, that was a messianic element, and here Jesus is bringing that back in, that idea, that messianic element idea. Why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself declares in the book of Psalms, and this is Psalm 110, and this is clearly indicated to be a messianic psalm. That is a psalm that praises or prays for or yearns for the day of the coming of the Messiah. Okay? It said that the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And so if the Lord is David, said to my Lord is the Messiah, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. David calls him Lord. Why would David call his descendant Lord if David's descendant is the Messiah? Okay, because one of the basic rules of thumb is that kings don't worship their descendants. They worship their ancestors. They honor their ancestors, the king before him, but not the ones after. And yet, Jesus is saying, maybe you don't quite understand how the Messiah thing is going to work out. And I think that's kind of the bug he's putting in their ear. But notice, David calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? And again, on the one hand, this is a question thrown out to the crowd that's there, to the Sadducees. Okay, either the Sadducees or the teachers of the law, because if the teacher of the law was just talking to him. But it's not resolved. Okay, Jesus doesn't give an answer here. Okay, other than to say that, and I think in hindsight, as we look at it, and the original readers would have looked at it, they would have recognized that Jesus, the Messiah concept, is not what the not what the Jews thought it was going to be. Okay, verse 45. While all the people were listening, now he's got everybody's attention. Okay, again, he's got the teachers of the law, he's got the people, he's got the chief priests, all the people that were around here. Jesus said to his disciples, so again, he's got this whole crowd there, and he's got his disciples over here, and I think what's interesting to me here, or the question that's not resolved, is whether the crowd can hear him. Okay, I'm sorry, I take that back. They clearly can hear him. How do I know that? Because it says in verse 41, verse 45, while the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, he says, beware of the teachers of the law. Watch out for these guys. Watch out for these Bible scholars. And there's Bible scholars sitting there listening to this. Okay. Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the banquets. Okay, so once again, we're back to talking about where you sit at a banquet here, okay? Something that is an interesting thing that keeps coming up in the gospel accounts, okay? But he says you can look at these guys. They're more interested in the pride of place, in looking right, in having the honored seats, than in what they really want to do. And he says, here's what they actually do. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers, okay? These men will be punished most severely. Now, what's interesting here is that in making these prayers, they no doubt think they're being very spiritual, or at least they're putting on that they're being very spiritual. And Jesus is saying, no, these guys are going to get punished most egregiously here, most severely. I'm going to bump into chapter 21 a little bit because I want to talk about the widow's mite because it fits, it goes with this, okay? As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Now, oftentimes people will talk about that there are some bells or whistles or things, which probably isn't the case, okay? This is just how Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, he's talking to the crowd, he's talking to the teachers of the law, he's making a statement about the teachers of the law. And as he's talking, he looks up. Because beware the teachers, they devour widows' houses. And he looks up and he sees the widow putting in her 2 small coins, the widow's mite, as it were. Okay. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Another way to translate that is to say she gave her whole life. Okay. Now, this is a really interesting passage, and it fits, it goes together with the passage beforehand. And there's a couple of different ways to look at this, okay? Now, for a long time, people have looked at these things separately. I just said, okay, and that's largely because of the chapter and verse division. Side note, chapter and verse divisions, not inspired, but that's how they're oftentimes, they're kind of split up like that. But be that as it may. So it's like, okay, that's that, and so you talk, oh, bad, and then you talk about this widow, oh, she's a great exemplar, okay? And she is, there's no question about it. This is a woman whose desire to be a part of giving, be a part of the temple, supersedes any desire for her to live, okay? So in that sense, she's an exemplar. Okay. Now, if you tie together the widow's giving with the condemnation of the teachers of the law devouring widows' houses, which is, I think that's a legitimate link that you can make there. You can say, well, he's not praising the woman, or he's not encouraging the woman to do that. He's saying that the activities of the teachers of the law caused this kind of stuff to happen. That all of a sudden you're going to have a woman who suddenly has nothing. All right, and we can look back to the different examples in our even last 30, 40 years, or I don't know, last 3 years, of some of these stories of televangelists and church leaders who encourage people to give way more than they really should. And giving out their life savings, and the leader of this particular organization, whether it's a church or evangelistic crusade or TV show or whatever, has a huge house and a jet and cars and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and you say, well, this is Jesus is this is just an example. Okay, and that's accurate that in that sense, but the other question is, you have to look at the woman and say, okay, Luke sometimes does this pairing, and we talked about this before, where he pairs like men and women. Okay, there was Simeon, there was Anna. Okay, and that's significant because here you have an old woman in the temple, just like Anna, and for us to look at and criticize this woman and say she's just under the control of this teachers of the law kind of takes away whatever agency she has. Okay, so there's no indication in the text that the woman is doing anything wrong, that the woman is being misguided. In fact, what this woman is doing is what Jesus told the rich ruler to do, to give all. Okay, what this woman is doing is what Elijah told the widow of Zarephath to do, just to give it all. Okay, let God, So this woman is perhaps in her giving the widow's mite is illustrating a level of faith that most of us will never have until we get to the point where we give it all. It's a problematic text, and you can go and people have gone different ways with it, but I don't see looking at this text as saying, okay, this is Jesus telling us all that we all need to do this, that we need to give our last penny so that we have nothing to live on, nothing to exist on. I do think this is in contrast, that the motivation behind this woman's giving is light years from the motivation of the giving of the teachers of the law and what's going on there. So, okay, well, that's about it for today. I will pick back up in Luke 21. We'll do a little end time stuff next week, and then we'll get into the details, 22, 23, and 24. We'll get into a highly narrative section where we're talking about the death, the betrayal, the trial, the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to being with you next time.